Hi, Earth Nation. This is Amanda with the Activated Earth, and I am here with Jenny O'Hare to talk about Nature Connection and everything that Nature Connection does for the world and her own personal experience with Nature Connection. I'm going to go ahead and read her bio to you, and there are a lot of juicy things in here I can't wait to ask you about. So, Jenny is a nature loving, experience it all human kind of being. She believes most deeply in our absolute belonging to the natural world and in a beautiful reciprocal relationship between humans and the web of life. Jenny is a depth ecologist and nature guide. That journey began in an enchanted, fascinated relationship with nature as a young girl, which led to completing a degree in earth science and a master's in ecological conservation, alongside work with various environmental organizations. Realizing the depth of human nature connection far beyond the scientific realm, and when a change of continent prompted a new learning of landscapes, both inner and outer, in 2015, she began to explore and offer deeper ways of connecting with the living world. Jenny has pursued training in nature resonance, ecotherapy, ecopsychology, spiritual ecology, and solo nature guiding. Nature has ever been her guide. Her own offerings draw on all of these modalities, but hold simplicity at their core, our presence and participation with the world. Her work has recently included seasonal nature connection toolkits, guided meditation practices, Wheel of the Year ceremonies, eco-grief circles, and supporting wilderness rites of passage. Jenny invites us back into our fundamental belonging with ourselves, with each other, and the rest of the living world. And I mean, just your bio is really beautiful and makes me feel connected with nature already just by listening to that. I'd really love to hear about your childhood experience with connecting with nature.
Thanks, Amanda. Yeah, I think even listening to that bio being read back to me there, it does strike me what a huge part my own childhood experiences have played in my experience in life, but also in the offerings that I've come through and that I continue to offer to others. And there is this part of my experience as a young person in the world that was quite in the realm of the enchanted and the magical and the seemingly sort of mysterious and mystery. And I used to have quite regular experiences where I thought that I could speak with animals, that I could hear the wind whisper to me, that I would go out and see all these messages in the clouds. And there's a really big part of our faculty as human beings that is to do with the imagination and the imaginal, and it's really where all of creativity starts. And we acknowledge that children hold this capacity quite deeply within themselves, but that we might lose that a little bit as we grow older into adulthood. But I remember being like that as a child, and I refused to sort of let go of any of those capacities and capabilities. And in fact, can notice them as even more essential now than they were when I was younger. So as a young person growing up, I was really fortunate, I think, to grow up in the time that I did, which is in the 80s, when we were still allowed to sort of roam freely and before technology really took a hold of our time and our attention and our days. And so I remember we had a stand of trees near where I lived, and we would spend hours and hours climbing these trees, and to know the trees intimately, every little branch, every little handhold, every foothold. It's such a landscape that we were really intimate with, and each person, in the little group of kids that I used to hang out with, had their favorite tree and had their spot that they would go to. And so that's a really natural way of being in this kind of interspecies relationship, or kinship, which is a word that we kind of hear being used a little bit more nowadays. But to know that as a safe space, and to know that as a place where one could go and just be, and hide out from the world if needed, but also to have fun and play and find your playmates there. We would make potions. We would use the berries that we would find on the trees, and we would naturally just make land art as offerings to the place, with fallen leaves and branches, and go and run up the streams, wander in the woodland and in the streams barefoot, and pick flowers, and just really be in this very easy, natural, organic way with the living world. As I said, we always had pets around, and any of the pets, I would really spend a lot of time being with them, like being really present with them, and being in this kind of maybe attuned state with them, and really feeling like I get a sense of how they were in any moment, or what was going on for them. And I think that was really just down to a quite, deep level of presence and attunement in a nervous system level with them. We were really lucky as well to spend a lot of our summers in great freedom at the coast, at the beach. And if you were to ask me what my sort of inner landscape is, which is a practice that we use in deep ecology often, it would most certainly be a coastal landscape. I think that the coast really formed me and my relationship with changeability and my relationship with the season of water, or the cycles of water, and the seasonal shift that we might see in those cycles as well. So a lot of time swimming, a lot of time running around barefoot, a lot of time gazing at the sky and gazing at clouds, and being able to just be in the freedom of experience and expression. So that was much of my experience as a child with the living world.
I had a similar experience. I never wore shoes. There was a woods to play in, trees to climb. You're taking me back to my own childhood and how free it felt, how good it was to just go outside and be outside all day and didn't come in unless you were hungry, which sometimes didn't happen. What kinds of things, when you were doing that, like if the wind is whispering to you, what kinds of things did you hear?
Interestingly, like nothing very, shall we say, tangible or solid. It was often always this feeling, like I could hear messages that were sort of landing in a place within me, or whispers, just a knowingness that this wind was coming from elsewhere and it had messages to bring if we could listen to it. It would also play in bigger ways, let's say, whereby the wind would shift. And this is really learning how to read the weather and whatever, but the wind would shift and maybe an hour later the weather would change. So then this would build on your capacity to actually be able to notice, actually the wind does have messages for me. It has both like figurative and literal messages for us. There were times when I would hear song or hear what would sound like music being carried on the wind. And I think that's, again, a reflection of our inner outer worlds, very much like being mirrored, in this state within, compared to what is happening without maybe hearing actual music or not. The reflection that offers you in terms of where you are internally and what your experience is in that moment of what's going on around you. A lot of the messages that I might have received as a child, from other beings, like the tree beings or the plants or the bushes, again are kind of received through the heart, is something I would say. They're not like spoken word, and they're not really a mental sort of message, or something that you could write down and make decipherable sense out of, but it's a sense, a sensation, an intuiting, shall we say, that is still available to us as adults for sure. And it's something that I recognize more deeply now, of actually all these messages were messages for me. They're very personal messages from the rest of the living world, about how it is that you might go forward, what is available to you in your experience of life as you move around through the living world. So much less tangible and much more in the realm of sensing, intuiting, feeling, kind of being more on that sort of heart-centered space, and then knowing that you were actually surrounded by a very living world, not seeing any of these things as objects, but actually knowing them as other living kin around you. It changes the way you move through the world. It changes how you feel about yourself and your own place in it. And perhaps that's more along the lines of the message that you receive. The picture of the world that you build up actually is very different when you feel like you're getting messages from other living beings around you, rather than just surrounded by an inert landscape, shall we say.
Mm-hmm. What it feels like to me, what you're describing is like being open. And as children, it's often easier to be open. We haven't been told that things aren't possible yet, or seen, bad things or picked up baggage. And is that something that you can help somebody with in hearing the message that nature has to offer? Being open?
Yeah, that's a really lovely way to reflect on that. And it is quite as simple as that. A lot of the work that I do is focused on simply coming back into presence and coming back into a kind of a more conscious awareness of where we might be in our own bodies at any given time. What are the living things that surround us? What are the bigger cycles or the bigger systems that we're held in? And the more aware that we can be, the more focused and the more present, or the more relaxed even, as opposed to focused, shall we say, the more we'll be able to pick up on, the more we'll be able to sense. And so being in an open state and being open to receiving is a really fundamental part of being alive in our world. You know, we're constantly receiving input and information, and we're receiving a high amount of information in our worlds nowadays, but we're also constantly receiving like sensory input, imaginal input, you know, emotional and kind of energetic input. And our body is this really wonderfully intelligent organism that can actually pick up on so much information and knowledge from around it. So when we can come back into a state within ourselves where we're more relaxed and more open to receiving those messages and that information that's around us, then what we can actually hold then as a human being really, really enriches our sense of aliveness, enriches our sense of what it means to be a human, because we know ourselves in relation to so much more than just a more narrow focus.
Yeah.
So that doesn't need to look like being, you know, like really heart-centered and open all the time. It can look like just tapping into one or two of our senses a little bit more deeply, really focusing on the physicality of ourselves, focusing on what I like to kind of remind us is like the animal of our bodies. You know, we have such a huge capacity in our sensory organisms, in the 5 primary senses of sight and smell and hearing and touch, but also how those senses create this very detailed picture of the world, but they also build on our internal sense of perception, our sense of time, our sense of intuition, our sense of gravity, our sense of speed, our sense of safety. You know, all of these things, there's this very complex interplay going on within us that is fed through our sort of more basic, you know, sensorial capacities. So if we can come into deeper attunement with those, we find ourselves in a really alive place, you know, in an alive world. So
I want to get clarity on what you were saying about, I want to make sure I understand. So the basic 5 senses, if we come into greater understanding and connection or relationship with those, then that enhances other senses, like what you were saying, sense of speed, sense of time, sense of humor.
mm-hmm.
Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah, that's great. Our sense of humor of Love Wonderful. I don't generally pull on that one, but I must remember to. Yeah, that's it exactly, Amanda. I think so the 5 primary senses are sort of like our gateway to the physical living, you know, the physical and tangible all around us. It's the primary way that we have of interacting with the world. It's like the first layer and the first level. It's worth remembering that I suppose each one of us has heightened capacities in some areas, and some of us have like favorite senses that we like to indulge in, and some of us have, you know, far more like underutilized senses. So if we can spend some time exploring these, and particularly if we can spend some time exploring them out in the living world where we're getting the input and the stimulus from the very same forces that would have evolved these senses with us through time, we're going to find ourselves in a place where all of the rest of our beingness comes on board a lot more, kind of like comes online, to use, you know, a more modern phrase for that. So if we can spend some time really tuning in to the senses, to our sense of sight, and really practicing what we're looking at, practicing looking far away, up close, looking for like details, and can we see the capillaries of the leaves? Can we then take a step back and see like scan the whole horizon of the forest? How much can we actually receive through the sight of, you know, what we're seeing? And if we can then tune into our ears and see how that enhances the picture of the landscape all around us, if we can then begin to touch things and say, okay, so now I'm building up a really real picture of, you know, what this world is. And if then we can start to smell, and then we can put, you know, once we know that a plant is safe and edible, if we can put some of that in our mouths, and then, you know, all of our senses combine to create this beautiful picture of what's going on around us. And then all of that lands in a much deeper place within us, where yeah, our more sensitive senses, shall we say, the less obvious ones, and the ones that require a little bit more attunement, those can then become more intelligent as well. So a lot of us might say, I don't have a great sense of like direction. And of course, we don't have a great sense of direction because we don't have to navigate essentially nowadays. But if we were to practice the five basic senses, practice aligning ourselves with the rising sun or the setting sun or the noonday sun, then our sense of direction would, really find its way very quickly, actually. So that's just really one example of all of the different senses that might be enhanced by a very seemingly simple practice.
Yeah, that's a great example with the sense of direction, because if you are observing and using your eyes and watching or maybe feeling the sun on your face at noon, then you'll know which way is where. I love that example.
Mm.
I was wondering, you use this term called nature resonance. All of this feels like it might be related. I was wondering if you could just explain what you mean by nature resonance.
Absolutely. And I do have to give thanks to one of my teachers here, with two teachers, Alex and Nikki, who run the plant medicine school here in Ireland. And they created this body of work, which they named Nature Resonance. And for them, it was really about coming back into a more natural state of being. And if we look at the frequencies at which we might exist, we can exist in a like really high tempo, high kind of like altered state. We might think of stimulants like caffeine and things like that that really push our nervous system into a slightly altered state. Or we might find ourselves sometimes in a lower or unregulated or deregulated state, down regulated, where we might be experiencing, some depression or low mood. And that's sort of one way of interpreting that we can be, that there's a whole spectrum, that we can be up or down, or we can, and we're recognizing that within that we're constantly in flow. So to use the term nature resonance then is to come into more natural alignment or a more natural frequency of being. And so that means a lot of the time spending time with the natural living world, and coming into a more natural way of being in a more natural state for ourselves, for our nervous system primarily. Our nervous system is really nourished when we spend time with other beings that live at a slightly slower pace, for example. When we can, as we've kind of named already today, like walking barefoot, when we can actually get our hands in the soil or touch the plants, and really engaging those senses. And it is very much to do with being in resonance rather than dissonance. So some people might understand those terms a little bit more easily when we use them together. So if something is in dissonance, we might feel it's a bit off, or I don't quite match with that, or I don't quite vibe with it. But if I really resonate with something, I really can get on board with it, and it feels good, and it feels a little bit more potentially normative for me. And that norm will be different for every individual. But actually, it's just coming into a place in ourselves that we feel good, that we feel a little bit better. And we'll all know that. It's like we all know what it's like to go and hang out with the person who's just like, oh yeah, I like their energy, I just get on with that person. And it can be the same with the living world. So when we try and explore nature resonance, we might try and find trees that we really get on with and that we vibe with, or the landscape that works for us. If you go to, some people love to go to the beach and to hear the crashing waves, and that's really soothing and settling for them. Some people love to go to the forest and to be in, a more quiet landscape. So it's really about finding that place within, at which you feel more rested, you feel more present, you feel more calm, you feel more like yourself. I think a lot of people will agree that if you take yourself out for a walk for an hour, you come back and you just feel better. You just feel more like yourself. So it's really not about getting too high tech with terms like, the nervous system regulation and whatnot, but just coming into a place that feels good.
What do you think is going on with people who don't want to be in nature? I see that happening. Like, there are people that they'd rather be inside, or they would rather not be exposed to heat or severe cold or bugs or whatever it is that can be out there. What do you think is going on with them? Are they don't seem to be resonating with nature?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's really interesting to apply that resonance in terms of that particular behavior. And what I would say in the first level of response to that is it's probably, this is not like an individual problem. Let's say, you know, when we ask like what's going on with those people, I think that what's happening in general is we're becoming more and more removed from a more natural landscape or a more natural environment, and that whatever we become normalized to, we actually adapt to it very quickly. So if someone has been removed from that landscape, from, you know, a living world landscape, and has grown up in a more urban environment or a more cityscape environment, they will become used to that very quickly. Like, we're very intelligent creatures actually, and we adapt very quickly. So people then who kind of don't really want to go outside are actually just expressing a sort of evolutionary trait. I think that it needs to come back down to like, is an awareness of where we're at, and whether we're choosing something consciously or whether we're choosing it by default. So if people are in this state where they, you know, they don't really like to go outside, as you said, they might be afraid of bugs, or they might just choose to like, I don't really like getting dirty, it's too hot, it's too cold. Noticing for those people that there's a place of comfort that they have found themselves in, that they're unable or unwilling to step outside of. And this place of comfort is actually a very safe space for us. And it's a very necessary place for us to be able to be as humans, to have that place of safety. So what are the ways in which we can make the living world accessible and attractive again to people? And it often isn't through the facts of like, well, this is very good for you and it's very unnatural for you to be, you know, cut off from the living world like this, or blah, blah. It's like, actually, hey, how does this feel? Do you enjoy this? Being curious and encouraging curiosity and acknowledging that comfort and safety are actually really, really big needs for us as human beings. And what are the ways that we can still be in tune with the living world in a place, at a pace of safety, a pace of trust, and a pace of comfort? That's always a really important factor, I think, because, you know, in a lot of places, not in Ireland, as we've talked about already as well, nature can actually be a very dangerous place to be. Like, certain landscapes can actually be very risky and can be threatening to the human. And so we have also kind of created this boundary, this barrier between like nature and humans. So it's really about remembering actually that there is no separation. There's physically no way that we can actually not be nature and not be in touch. If I was to ask you to point to where on your body or where on your skin air is touching, like everywhere, everywhere, we're completely exposed and in tune and in connection with the elements and with the living world all the time. So how do we invite people back into that relationship is a very important question, I think. And I think there's been some new figures released that like by the year 2050, I think 68% of the world's population will be living in urban spaces or cityscapes. So this is an increasing trend of what we're seeing, is people moving into city spaces and places where the green might, you know, the green living world might not be so present. So we do really need to get very creative and very curious about how we're going to invite life along with us, or how we're going to continue to be in relationship. So I think that's kind of our responsibility of where we're at the moment, you know, especially for people who are holding this in their awareness. How do we keep that doorway and that pathway open to like a deeper relationship and that communication that is available to us all?
I really love the way you put all of that, because it was done with neutrality, and that everybody is accepted, and you can, that the importance, like I like to be outside, but I also have a very bad relationship with mosquitoes, and I will get bites and they itch for months. So it's really unpleasant, but I'm still out there, and I still go, I just cover up as best I can. So I want to thank you for reminding everybody that it's okay to enjoy comfort and to feel safe. I was wondering, as far as your own personal journey, what is it that you were talking about for in 2015 with the continent, the change in continent? Like what is it you were talking about there? Could you share a little bit of your own personal experience?
Yeah. So in 2015, I moved from Ireland to mainland Europe, and I hadn't lived in Ireland for all of my adult life, but I had been sort of coming and going a lot, and had spent quite a bit of time both on the island of Ireland and in other countries across the globe. but this connection to home, like Ireland was always definitely, you know, my place of home. And in 2015, I moved to mainland Europe and lived there for 6 years, but I went and moved to a big city actually. And what I found was this really great living need of people to be more in tune with the living world, and they missed it. Like in the cityscape, it was that very real presence of missing. You know, people were really crying out for a deeper connection. And actually, in that move itself, for me as well, it required me to reform completely my relationship with place and my relationship with land. So coming from Ireland, which has just always felt deeply alive in my bones, and just the place that I know is very alive. I have all my spots that I go to. I have all my landscapes that I resonate with. I have all my kin and, you know, my tree buddies and all of that. Moving to a new place entirely and having to start from fresh. And I was like, wow, so what does it really look like to actually form relationship with place? And what is the role that place and the non-human actually play in our wellness, plays in our creativity, plays in our relationships with the humans that play out. So having to kind of formulate that again from scratch. And what actually happened was I made friends with, with a lot of trees and a lot of groves in parks, probably before I made like my really good human friends there. And I also was really just listening to who was present, you know, mapping what animals and what other creatures I could see in my urban environment, really coming into relationship with any of the cycles and the elements that I could, you know, like really tracking the sun, really tracking the moon, really tracking the weather systems that were present, and just trying to build up a bigger picture of like, what is the ecosystem that I'm held within, which is, you know, definitively like urban, but it's still an ecosystem, and who else is here with me, and who are my allies, and what is my role within this particular sort of ecosystem. So that looks like, you know, becoming part of urban permaculture projects and social permaculture projects, you know, and really trying to marry the world of the human and the non-human. And I think that's when I really began to respond more deeply to that need, that humans were really crying out for, sort of how do we become, how do we not lose our connection with the living world if we want to be living in these urban spaces? And so that was a sort of a creative opening for me in terms of, well, how are we carrying nature within us, and how are we holding that relationship? So depending on whatever is available to you, no matter what your landscape looks like, inside or outside, what is the quality of your relationship to the living world, and what is the quality of your relationship to life itself and to your own life? And if looking at that through the lens of what's alive around you.
In those groups, what are some of the things that people did create, as far as, for instance, the urban permaculture? What did people create that brought them in connection with nature?
So it was really great actually to see people get so creative with growing their own food, particularly, you know, any balcony space, any windowsill, any space that there was near to a window to have like hanging plants, you know. People getting really creative with their green fingers, even though there was a very limited amount of space itself. Also then getting creative with whatever tiny green space there was on the streets. So, you know, on a tree-lined street, any little area around the ground of that tree then also became a garden. So all these like tiny little mini garden plots that, you know, were cordoned off and really tended to. So one person taking responsibility for the little garden plot, and that could become like your own little mini garden in the middle of this big city. We also got in tune with a lot of the cafes and the stores in the area that would have a lot of leftover foods, and how we could redistribute that to people in need in the community. So that was more like the social permaculture side of things. How can we make this a sustainable system for the humans and the non-humans in the space? It also looks like getting together and holding rituals and really making collective meaning of the things that were important to us. So this is something I think that actually the intangible benefits of this are so deep and go so much further than we could predict, like what it means when we can get together as humans and share in that which we find, I'm going to say valuable or precious, which is another way of saying sacred. Like what is really, really important to us. Yes, I really honor the fact that it rained, you know, like let's go and celebrate the rain tonight. Or being able to just get it together in our local little green space and hold some like really concerted time of giving thanks for what was available to us. This is sort of a practice that I think really returns us to a really good place within ourselves, but returns us to like a better relationship with the living world. We're meaning making creatures, and it's not just all about the physical and the tangible. We have to have that sort of deeper set of values that guide us as well. So creativity was really a big one, and how we might come into deeper relationship with our own food. And that's a way that we could be a little bit more autonomous as well in a city that is so full of sort of external systems, shall we say. Yeah, working directly with whatever living life was available around us in terms of the trees and the bushes and the little streetscapes, and then making sure that we were tending to ourselves and each other as well in that collective organizing and making time for that.
Lovely. I have spoken about permaculture with some of the other speakers in the summit, and we've discussed it in terms of what we do with the land as far as permaculture. And you bring up social permaculture, and you've already actually mentioned a lot of the actions that you do when you're practicing social permaculture. Could you give the audience a definition of social permaculture? What does that mean?
That's a tricky question.
I know.
I don't think that I do have a strict definition of social permaculture, but I think if we were to take the values of permaculture, which is to make, I was gonna use the word sustainable here, but I think sustainable as a word or as a theme or phrase has become almost defunct because it's used in so many places now where it's to keep the status quo going, and the status quo is not sustainable. So,
right.
I do prefer to use the words regenerative. So creating the conditions such that something will continue to be able to sustain itself is probably one way of looking at that. So if we are to look at social permaculture, what are the conditions that we can create? What are the practices that we can enlist so as that what we're inhabiting continues to be able to live on through us, with us, beyond us, in a good and healthy way? And so in a social sense, what are some of the things that we need to feed us as humans, as social creatures, to feed us internally, to feed our souls and our hearts and our minds, as well as to feed us in terms of physical food and nutrients, in that sense. So I don't know if that's any closer to a definition, but it's certainly an inquiry.
No, I ask questions like that because so many people have different definitions, and I feel like they're all valid. They're all valid. I love everybody's interpretation of everything. And mostly the reason why I asked it is because I wanted to segue into the fact that you have talked about the Great Turning. And for me, that's a term that I came across by taking permaculture design courses. I don't know if you're familiar. I don't know where you got the term from, but I'm familiar with it through Joanna Macy, who's the author of a book, and she talks about the Great Turning in her book. And I would love it if you would share what you mean by what's happening now. What is the Great Turning?
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing that in, Amanda. And I have actually done quite a bit of training in the work that reconnects as well. And I was really lucky enough to train with a woman named Lydia Haratunian, who is a direct sort of disciple of Joanna Macy's, shall we say. Yeah, and so interestingly now, as part of that body of work, they proposed sort of the 3 potential stories that we might be living in. And of course, I guess to begin with that, you have to acknowledge that we're all living within stories. And so as part of these 3 potential stories, and the Great Unraveling, Business as Usual, and the Great Turning, actually the work that Reconnects has now really stepped away from the first 2 stories and said, actually, we can't even put our focus or our attention on these. The Great Unraveling might be happening all around us. Business as usual is sort of happening at the same time for many, but actually we're going to focus on the Great Turning. And when I talk about the Great Turning, I like to say the Great Turning of hearts and minds. And so this is this return, I think, to the things that nourish us, and this return to interconnection, this return to our sense of belonging with the living world and with one another as human beings. And the fact that we can't be unbelonged by this life. We've been brought here and we belong here, and our place on the earth and our role as human beings is to be a really beautiful part of the web of existence. And the turning is the kind of turning maybe away from the stories that don't resonate with us, that we don't want to believe in, the stories that are damaging to us, turning away from the things that aren't supporting life and turning back towards life itself. So that's kind of encouragement, I hope, for like people to find their own way with it. Like, what matters to me? What do I care about in this living world? What is it that I can do? And it's not asking people to, overstretch themselves and to try and make every effort to be part of this solution, but rather maybe asking those questions of themselves, like what calls to me, what calls to my point of care. And if we can come back to a place in ourselves where we're feeling nourished in our hearts and nourished in our minds, then our actions will undoubtedly and just naturally be part of that great turning that is needed for the enhancement of life itself.
That's great. I feel like I need to sit with that too. However, I'm going to ask you another question instead. Along with all of those things that you have talked about, that what's happening, the transition with the world and this idea of the great turning, and all of us who are participating actively in creating that consciously. Others may be actively participating in it, and it might not be done consciously, but we are consciously working to create paradise, to create ease and abundance and sovereignty for people. When you look back on your path, how has nature guided you to where you are right now? What are some of the keystones, I guess, to how you ended up where you are?
That's a really great question. And again, is the type of question that does invite a certain level of reflection. But I'll try and dive straight in. And so what I'm hearing in that question is, maybe on one level, like, what is the role that the living world has played in my path? And the simple answer to that is it's been mostly everything. I can't disseminate the things that I've responded to as in any way, not connected to the living world. But what are some of the bigger markers along the way? Interestingly, it's being in certain landscapes, I will receive a certain sort of arising within my, in my being, in my soul, in my heart, a feeling or a sense of this is what's needed in this place. And I very much believe that humans are sort of an expression of the land, and culture itself is a kind of an arising of the human relationship with place, right? That's one way of interpreting or defining culture. But as human beings, that we can give voice to, and that we can give expression to the way that the living world is want to live through a place. So what that has looked like for me was living, for example, in New Zealand, and being really embedded in a culture there where legislation and legalities and everything around the living world were very, very strong. And so I spent a little bit of time like really sensing into that and looking at the more bureaucratic or technical ways that we can actually try to protect and conserve nature. And those are all very valid responses to a sort of a diminishing living world, shall we say. And that was one path that I did follow a little while, and working more strongly in conservation and saying, okay, well, if this is one capacity that we have as humans, to listen to the living world, and to put measures in place in response to that in terms of a conservation sort of action and act, that was something that seemed very sensical at the time. And I think then traveling onwards from there and returning from a sort of travel in the southern end of the world back to the northern hemisphere, back to a place of seasons and cycles, and actually saying, well, if we can come into a more listening place, and if we can be held within these patterns and these cycles and listen to what each one is telling us, then we'll know how to move through the world, how to navigate through the world. So like following the wheel of the year, following winter's guidance, spring's guidance, summer's guidance, what are some of the actions that we might be taking on a broader scale, if we can look at those patterns and those cycles and how they are themselves mirrored and enlarged throughout the bigger way of how we're acting right now, coming into a space of sort of activism response, shall we say, and looking at the kind of urgent response that happened in terms of Extinction Rebellion and things like that, that were very much cultural sort of nucleus uprisings, shall we say. When I was in a city, it was very much that sort of urgent response. But actually, what does it look like if we take the pause of winter, and if we take a pause of the pandemic, and really sense into that as a very natural part of any living system or living cycle, and listen more strongly to what is needed in this moment. So that would, like, those are some of the bigger things that I sense into in recollecting my path, like, you know, being in different places in the world and seeing that different cultural response to what is needed in a cityscape again versus, you know, a more urban space versus a place like Ireland, where we would be much more rural collectively, you know, across the nation. The response being a lot more literal to, well, what is happening directly around us, and how can I be more attuned and more in tune with that. There's probably a lot more markers I could probably pull out there, but hopefully that sort of does it for now.
Answer. I really love it. I would like to know what you mean by Extinction Rebellion.
Yeah, so maybe not everyone's familiar with that movement. So that was an activism movement that became quite, I think it arose in the UK and it spread across Europe, across mainland Europe, certainly, as a very strong activist response to the threat of climate change. So they were a movement that were promoting direct action. So that would look like street blockades, it would look like train blockades, it would look like real disruption, like disrupting the norm of this sort of business as usual model. And it was a very impassioned movement, and it really did capture people's hearts and people's imaginations. And then I think slowly people began asking that question of like, what energy is the energy that I want to be feeding? Do I want to be feeding this like against energy, or do I actually want to be using that energy to create something that is more life affirming, that is more life giving? I really value the role of each response to the place that we find ourselves in the earth right now. I think activism plays a really large part in bringing these messages to a more collective audience that might not already be aware of it. I really respect the role of those who really feel that passion to fight on behalf of, as much as I respect the role of the growers and the people who return to the land and putting their hands back in the soil. And, you know, as in the same way that I respect the people who are kneeling down and praying every day to, you know, the God of life all around them. I think these are all really natural responses. And in the nature of biodiversity of life, each one of these responses is needed. Each one of us is needed. Right. And so maybe that's again kind of guiding us towards the great turning. Like, what is my response? Like, what do I truly feel is the place where I can be in most natural alignment to what is going on in the world right now?
So all these experiences have sprung forth from you, all these modalities that you utilize to help other people. And I would love to hear one of the ones that you really is maybe really one of your favorites, just to expand on one of those for us. You have all these eco modalities. I'm curious to hear in depth about one of them.
Okay, great. That's really hard to choose, but can I choose two?
Choose two.
I think maybe I'll weave the second one in somehow.
Yeah.
I think that if I was to name one, it would certainly be that of deep ecology. And so I come from a scientific background originally, where I studied natural sciences and ecosystem conservation. So that's really looking at the way that life operates, the way that we understand like the bigger cycles of time and geology and geomorphology and all those things. And also the weather, you know, the systems that play out on a more biological scale, shall we say, and living organisms and their role in relationship to each other, their role in relationship to the systems that they're part of. So this in the tradition of science, in the very natural order of science, shall we say, is quite a reductionist area of study. Ecology itself and ecosystems, and deep ecology looks to take some of that information and those facts and the things that we know about life and about the system of and the structure of systems, and actually look at what that might mean and what is our part as humans to play in it, rather than being observers of these ecosystems. Actually, what's our deeper impact, what's our deeper relationship with the systems that we are embedded in and that we are a part of. It naturally arose sort of in the 60s and 70s as a kind of counter response to the modern environmental movement. So it was like in the 60s and 70s where it became quite obvious, based on scientific feedback and research, that a lot of the actions that we were partaking in terms of industry and agriculture was beginning to damage the living world and damage the environment. And again, in a reductionist sort of way, we were looking at small responses. Well, let's contain that over here, or let's minimize the use of that chemical, or let's counteract that chemical with another chemical. So deep ecology was sort of sitting over here and saying, well, actually, why are we taking these actions? And what does it mean to us to find ourselves in a position of supposed sort of power or responsibility to these systems that we can potentially damage so much? So it was really asking deeper philosophical questions of what does it mean to be human? What is the role of the human on the planet? How do we be in what we might term right relationship with the facts of science that have, you know, seemingly over like the last 300 to 500 years brought us to this place of like immense intelligence and immense information? What do we do with those facts? If I take myself out and ask the living world these questions, what response might I receive? So deep ecology really invites in all of the faculties of what it means to be human, not just the physical faculties and the energetic and elemental relationship that we're in with all of the rest of life, but also the sort of more intuitive relationship, the felt relationship. It invites in the philosophical, the imagination. It invites in poetry, it invites in everything that we can possibly enlist to actually help us to live this inquiry well. How do we be in right relationship? So the reason that I love this as a modality is because it does actually marry all these different worlds together, and it really attempts to invite in the whole of what it means to be alive on the planet. And so it also allows great value for the relationship that each individual has with the systems that they're part of. So systems theory is the way that we study biological systems and living systems, and it's a way that we attempt to study them because we can never fully grasp and understand them. But we do also know that any system is greater than the sum of its parts, which means that when all of the parts of a system come together, the impact and the end product and the end sort of result that they show could never have been predicted if we simply added up all the ingredients or any of the individuals in that part, which means that there's an emergent intelligence, that something happens when we're in relationship with one another, when we're all in relationship together, that we can't predict until we're in that relationship together. And so the end result would be different if I took out any individual member of that system. So if you and I are not in this ecosystem, the ecosystem will behave differently. And so this really returns us to how important we are actually as part of life, and as how important we are as part of the web of the living world. And it also determines that like we really do have the potential to impact that of which we are part. We have the potential to impact the systems, and we have the potential to inhabit our spaces more deeply. Deep ecology also really recognizes the inner and the outer world and the interplay between the two. And so a lot of my work is based on guiding what's called nature solos, and that's, you know, really just supporting people to go out into a certain landscape for a determined length of time, maybe with a question, an inquiry, reflection. You know, it's based on a lot of pan-cultural sort of traditions that might be known as a rite of passage or a vision quest. And so we can take ourselves out into the rest of the living world and ask the life around us a question, or carry an inquiry within us, and come back with a story of what has happened for us out there, and tell that story to our community, to another group of human beings, and know that there's like this great wisdom that's been playing out. You know, oh, you know, this ally came to me, or this thing happened, these elements were really present. when this happened out there, my heart felt this, or my mind suddenly had a euphoric moment where it was like, oh my God, now I know I have the answer to my question. There's, it's really acknowledging the relationship, the mirror that nature is, and the guide that nature is. And so sometimes we just have to clear a pathway for that intelligence to find its way to us. So that's the beauty of a nature solo. And that's also the beauty of deep ecology, is that it absolutely recognizes that relationship between the inner and the outer. Is that you can see a certain flock of birds flying across the sky and receive a message internally. And that's very real. And that's as it should be.
Yeah. Yeah. Normalizing magic. Everything that I heard you say sounded like magic to me. And it's just, it's normal. It's the way things are. Just so beautiful. I love the way you managed to weave all of those in together. It was beautiful. And if anybody out here is listening who really wants to get in touch with you, which I can imagine they do, how would they get a hold of you?
Sure. So I have a Linktree page where all of my contact details are, and all of my offerings are all there in one space together. So that's link.tree at Jenny O'Hare, JENNYOHARE.
And that's on your Instagram page, right?
It
Your
is
tree
indeed.
is on there. It what?
Yes.
It is. Perfect. So if they go to, and you're just Jenny O'Hare on there. Oh, no, wait, do you have a handle?
I do have a handle. You'll find me through Jenny O'Hare, but the handle is a tree called life. So a.tree.called.life, because I really believe that this life that we're living has like so much depth and rootiness to it, and so much beauty in the boughs and in the way it's in relationship with everything all around us.
And you have definitely brought the depth to the whole nature connection conversation. Thank you so much, Jenny, for your contribution. For me, it has been very juicy and yummy. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's been such a pleasure, Amanda. Thank you so much for hosting this and for the beautiful work that you're doing as well. I really believe in it, and thank you for having us.
You're welcome. I'm glad to be part of this synergy.